Thank you all very much for joining us today. So I want to again thank Asian Society and the Asian American Journalists Association's New York chapter for sponsoring for today's event. Welcome to our panel on the rise of the Asian American candidates in the 2024 election. I'm Ben Pu. I'm a producer for NBCU Academy with the NBCU News Group, the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion team. I work primarily on a core set of products that basically is trying to teach journalism for a living, and we try to make the journalism industry more diverse and more equitable through our stuff. You can check it out at NBCUacademy.com. I'm wearing the socks today. A little corporate plug for you all, so enjoy that. I also previously covered the 2020 election for NBC News as a campaign embed. I covered Senator Elizabeth Warren. Then I also was based in Iowa and then covered the Nevada caucuses and also covered, business stories, economics, labor unions, things like that. First off, happy AAPI Heritage Month to everyone. I really want to take this moment to acknowledge how lucky we are to be in this moment. We're seeing the true diversity of the AAPI experience reflected here on this stage. And not just here on this stage, but also in politics, in film, in television, in business, and now in journalism, which I'm so happy about. What you see on this stage used to be so incredibly rare, and we're really, really lucky to have this kind of opportunity to present this all for you. So we're here to talk about 2024, but we're also talking about 2020 and perhaps abroad to 2028. And we're looking at a reflection of what it means to be Asian American and how it collides with the realities of what it takes to run for president of the United States. What's in the handbook for the Asian American presidential candidate? Tonight we're going to find out. So I'd like to welcome my friends and colleagues. First off, Zohreen Shah, reporter at ABC News. You can catch Zohreen on Good Morning America, World News, Nightline, and ABC News Live. She covered then Senator Kamala Harris during the 2020 election, and we also crossed paths many times covering Andrew Yang, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit. Next, Velshi, host of Velshi on MSNBC, and their chief correspondent and weekly economics contributor at NPR's Here and Now, and he's covered multiple presidential elections and covered stories all across the world. Up next, Deepa Shivaram is a political reporter at NPR where she covers the White House, Department of Justice, and elections. And you can catch her reporting on Morning Edition, All Things Considered, and the NPR Politics podcast. She was previously at NBC News covering Senator Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren's campaigns. And last but not least, we have Dylan Wells, a campaign reporter at the Washington Post covering the 2024 campaign and down ballot races as part of the Post Next Generation team. And I met her in Iowa as well, where she was covering the caucuses with CNN in 2020. What an amazing panel that we have here today. We're so lucky to have them here. Please give them all a warm welcome. Thank you guys very much for being here. So we're first and foremost, we're going to start about the complicated issues of identity and our experiences as journalists, being AAPI journalists, the way that people see us. Ali, you and I spoke earlier when we were preparing this for this conversation, and you talked about how the news industry is changing, right? But that when you started out, there was a sense that you kept your identities in a box and you put it away on a shelf, and you didn't want to be pigeonholed or identified a particular way. Can you talk to me a little bit about that and what that experience was like?
Thank you, Ben. Good to see you, by the way. Ben used to sit right next to our team, so I think he's heard me say everything I've ever said in life. It wasn't just put in a box. It was put in a really tight box and locked, and the key was lost. You definitely, if you had an event of Asian American journalists back in the day when I was the age of most people on this panel, it would be in a phone booth. Everybody who was out there at the time did lean into helping others, but generally speaking, I think the subtext of the advice was keep your head down. Do your work, do not draw attention to any way in which you might be different from anyone else. Certainly on the side, we all did things for the community, we'd be invited to speak at events, but the two worlds didn't meet. Right? As a journalist, members of the, you and I talked about this, community was community writ large. It wasn't, there were other Asian communities that would invite me because they didn't have their own. Back then, it really was almost a more united group because if you were anything kind of like Asian or brownish or not whitish or, identifiably something else, people would want to talk to you. But on TV, it never played a role. And I think we missed something because of that, because we grew into a way of doing things that was not about identifying with your background, your culture, or your upbringing. Fortunately, we're now in a world where that stuff is welcome, but I think for young journalists, it becomes a real question is, do I lean heavily into that? Do I not lean heavily into it? And I don't know that there's a good answer to that, but there are choices now that didn't exist back in those days.
Well, and speaking of choices, Deepa is actually one of my inspirations because she told me to lean into it when I was covering Nevada. So Deepa, I want to ask you, we talked a little bit about this as well. You don't have those fears of pigeonholing. You don't mind that, and I would love for you to talk about that and kind of explore that for us.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as you were talking, Ali, and it's so cool to be sitting next to you because I always loved being on Ali's show when I was at NBC, and you always have a good conversation, and it's people like him, the Ann Currys of the world. I don't know if you guys ever watched NBC growing up. I did, and Ann Curry is like the reason I went into journalism and I went into reporting, and I do think it's not an accident that she's also Asian American. I saw myself reflected doing this job that I totally ran after with everything I had. But I remember like kind of getting along in my career, starting out at NBC. And people would tell me like, oh, you don't want to like pigeonhole yourself. Like if you're reporting on issues about being Asian American and the Asian American community or the Indian American community specifically, like, oh, of course they put the Asian reporter on that, like don't pigeonhole yourself. And after a while I was kind of like, I don't feel pigeonholed. Like I'm happy to be here. I'm Asian. I relate to this community. I can do the kind of storytelling that other reporters can't. Why does that have to be seen as a negative thing? Why can't I bring my full self to this job and do the kind of storytelling that maybe other people wouldn't be able to see or do? And it just even well into being an embed, this was through 2020, like when I started doing a lot of stuff with Kamala Harris and things like that, people would be like, oh, of course they sent you. And I was like, yeah, of course they sent me. I want to be here. I've made that very clear. So it's not to me, and I think it is such a point of privilege to be a young Asian journalist these days, to know that I can walk into a room, tell those kind of stories, almost exclusively tell those kinds of stories, and know that that is not a hamper, like a damper on my career. That is only something that I can bring to the table in a positive way. And that is due to a lot of the work that the Alis and all the other Asian journalists that came before us have put in the work so that our generation can feel this way and feel empowered by that. And I don't take that lightly because I know that that's a big difference than what it used to be.
Right. So one thing that Deepa said that others would not see or do. The see part is really important, right? There's things that your experience lets you recognize or see or understand that someone without your experience simply wouldn't. So I think that's where the value is, that we all bring an experience that allows us to see things that others may gloss over or not see as important.
Totally.
There's an incident in San Francisco's Chinatown with Senator Kamala Harris when she was campaigning. We'll touch on that in a second.
Yeah.
I would love for you to bring that up.
Totally.
Recognizing that. And Zohreen, too, you were based in California. You were at the LA Times, right? And then when you joined ABC News as an embed, you took a pay cut to be one of us. For those who don't know, the embed position is basically a job that the network television stations use young idiots for, like some of us. We are cheap.
Speak for yourself, man.
Our backs aren't great. We still have all of our bones, and it's a really wonderful opportunity for all of us to see the country, to speak to voters and things like that. And you became an ABC News embed, and then you aggressively told them basically, like, I want to be Kamala Harris's embed. Why did you do that?
Yeah, at the time I was at Fox 11, the local station in Los Angeles, and even when it came to negotiating my second contract there, I asked for an out, which meant that if I get a specific job, I'm out. And the job I wanted was to cover Harris's campaign, the senator from my state. And so it was like, if I get a political job at a network, like it was like very carefully worded, and ended up getting that job. And the reason is, by the way, also speaking of inspiration, yours was Ann Curry, mine was Zayn Verjee. She kind of looked like me. She had a Z name, and she looks South Asian. I think she was Kenyan, but it came across like really randomly. I was listening to the politics podcast that ABC had at the time, and Jonathan Karl on there said the word Pakistani, and he said it correctly. And so I messaged him and Rick Klein, and I said, hey, by the way, I tweeted them. I said, thanks for saying Pakistani correctly. And Rick Klein added me back on Twitter, and I would send him notes all the time on Kamala Harris. I didn't even work for this guy, but I was like,
and Rick Klein is the political director at ABC News.
I was like, hey, you should keep an eye on this, or hey, she's doing this, or this is happening in LA, or this is happening with Senator Harris. And he eventually hired me after like a zillion rounds of interviews. But no, I really leaned in. I mean, if Senator Harris wasn't running, if I didn't hear those murmurs back in 2016, at the end of 2016, that she might be getting the race, would have never negotiated that out. Would have never have jumped over and pushed so hard. And yeah, you know, covering that race. I mean, I never went back to local news. Ended up staying here, and it changed my life. So.
And well, you know, one of the interesting things about this, and I think that people here may not appreciate, you know, we live in New York City, maybe we don't appreciate the magnitude of this, is that both Zohreen and Deepa were assigned to cover Kamala Harris's campaign for 2 of the major television networks in America. Exceedingly, extraordinarily rare. And I want to first talk, like, Deepa, what was that experience like of covering that campaign with just the diverse press corps that it was?
Yeah.
No, but, you know, you told me that the campaign specifically requested that.
Yeah, so I had been told that the campaign was talking to the networks, being like, look, this was a time when the networks also, I think, were at a point where, like, we need to diversify our embed corps. And so what everybody's group looked like was receiving a lot of attention. I don't know if you guys were very clocked in, but at the same time that all the networks were announcing, CBS had an unfortunate incident where I think they just received a lot of blowback for not having a diverse enough embed corps. So like all the networks were like very on top of that, you could say. And so that was something that like television was paying attention to, definitely something the campaigns were paying attention to. And I think for the Harris press corps, you know, having a press corps that is diverse changes the way you are covered, changes the way that people notice things, report on things. So that was something they were obviously very keyed into. But Ben and I were talking about this over the weekend. Being a part of the Harris press corps was the most diverse place I've ever worked. And as I was 24, and as like a young brown woman, and I went to work every day, and at work meant like this middle school gymnasium in Iowa, this like random field in New Hampshire. Like it was never an office, obviously, but every day I went to work with a group of people that were primarily women of color. And it was hugely impactful for me as a reporter to learn from Kyung La, to be standing shoulder to shoulder with Zohreen every day, with Jasmine Wright from CNN. It was a primarily black and brown press corps, and it was really extraordinary to be a part of that. And it would be sometimes like, you know, you had the candidate that you cover, but oftentimes your network will send you out and be like, oh, you know, so-and-so, Beto is coming here, can you just pop over and cover this event for the day? And when I would do that and I would go cover other candidates' events, it's a very big difference in the press corps that covers those other candidates and the people that are showing up to those events, like the town halls, the rallies, like the crowd makeup is so different. And so it was a little bit of a stark realization after a while that I was like, oh, other people's press corps don't look like this. It doesn't feel like this to be a part of other candidates' press corps. And that was an interesting realization. And I do think that kind of camaraderie, that mentorship that I got, the ability to kind of learn from so many incredible other women of color who were part of that press corps was personally, professionally, a very impactful experience. And I do think it had a really big difference in the kind of coverage we delivered.
Yeah, and Dylan, you know, one of the things that we were just, you know, kind of referencing is that a lot of media organizations have recognized their shortcomings when it comes to the way that we cover candidates, but also the way that we cover politics, and they want more diversity. They're actively interested in hearing from younger voices. So I want you to tell us about, you know, the next generation cohort that you're part of at the Washington Post. What do they have you know, covering? What do they want you to cover? What do they want you to focus on there? And talk a little bit about your experiences there yet.
Yeah, the Next Generation team is all about reaching younger and more diverse audiences and kind of branching the Post out from the traditional paper print subscribers. And I think I'm very lucky to be in a newsroom that has seen that value, has seen the type of coverage that many of you did on the trail last cycle, and seen what an asset it is to have a woman of color covering these candidates and picking out different things that might not have been noticed in the past. And I think it's still so evolving. Like, while I'm so appreciative of the fact that that team exists, also, a lot of the Asian American reporters I know are on the stage right now. Like, there's not that many of us.
Like, see, here's what you get, folks. That's
it is still.
There's a couple more.
No. This is not everyone, but it's still a definite minority of the press corps. And when you think about it, the electorate is getting more diverse. Asian Americans are one of the fastest growing voting groups in the country. Each class of Congress gets more and more diverse. Each class of presidential candidates is getting more diverse. And so I think it's important for these news organizations to have that reckoning and understand that we can bring our identity to the reporting in a way that is not prejudiced, is not coming in with preconceived notions because of our background, but allows you to be a better reporter and better understand these dynamics.
And go for it.
Remember, I don't know if you've probably all seen the video of Shirley Chisholm when she, what am I doing here? Shirley Chisholm when she decided to run for president. She announced at the National Press Club in Washington. The press corps was all male, all white. And the thing that stands out if you watch that video is they laughed at her. Right? And she got it. She understood that she was in a press corps that was going to laugh at her, so she laughed too. It almost seemed like everybody was in on the joke, but nobody took her seriously. To that all-male, middle-aged press corps, this black woman running for president was not a possibility. It was quaint. It was cute. We had to cover this thing because somebody told us, the assignment desk told us we have to go to the National Press Club and cover it. So it's so much more than just it's the idea that someone's taken seriously. And if it takes people, a more diverse press corps, to understand that take this person seriously, evaluate them on their merits, hold them to account, do what you have to do. But we do have a history in this country where we just treated these things like jokes in the past. So at least now this is some signal that we believe that this is worthy of the kind of coverage that we should give it. So it's a big, big historical moment to be able to say that you covered a campaign that had that level of diversity in the coverage.
Right. And now, well, then, speaking of that, we're going to turn now to the candidates and the way that we cover our own personal experience of covering AAPI candidates, which is what you're all here to hear about, really. It's like, Ali, you spoke to Yang multiple times. You interviewed him multiple times on MSNBC. You've appeared on panels with him recently and things like that. Then, for those of you who may remember, Yang was famously the Asian candidate who made fun of the fact that he was Asian, openly. Math, Asian, the Asian doctor jokes at the Democratic debates, and like kind of this joking appeal to voters, the whipped cream and all that stuff. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you should Google it. It's very weird. And you interviewed him. And what was your sense of the political calculus for his Asian identity while he was running for president? Like, what did you see in that?
So it felt closer to, even though he's younger, he felt close to my generation in the sort of say it, own it, and get it out of the way kind of thing, as opposed to pretend it's not there. Some people criticize him for the degree to which he leaned into it because he played into what some say are stereotypes. But the bottom line is he took the idea that there might be stereotypes around an Asian candidate and combined them with the stuff that he was actually really into. I mean, he wrote a book in which all his policies were there, which for a reporter is fantastic. It's like, oh, you've written it all down. I can question you about it. I can research it. And so he was sort of saying, I am that guy. I'm studious, I'm determined, I'm policy-oriented, I've written it all down, I'm prepared to be held to account for it, and I can make some jokes about it, so have at me. And there's a world in which that could have worked. And circumstances are what they are. But there's a world in which he was saying, take me seriously. I've written it down. I am some of those things you might think of when you think of an Asian candidate, but that's good for you. You actually probably want a president who is. And so I liked that he did that. I also, more importantly, as a reporter, I liked the idea that he was a very policy-oriented guy, as was obviously Elizabeth Warren, one of the most policy-oriented people this country's ever seen, or Hillary Clinton, or Bernie Sanders or Amy Klobuchar, but that's absent politics these days. To have somebody who actually says, this is what I'll do if I get elected president, and it's not about retribution, and it's not about the other guys, and it's not about all sorts of politicized stuff, it's actually about fact. I have always enjoyed watching Andrew Yang and the choices that he's made. He's made some unusual ones, but for a reporter, I find him interesting.
I think one of the interesting things you also noted out is that all the folks that you mentioned as being very policy-oriented, wonkish, none of them are president of the United States. And
correct.
So that's something to consider. It's that
for the next panel.
Right, exactly. That's
I'm from Canada. That stuff would work up there.
Right,
because you're running Canada.
One observation, I was actually just at the Asian American Foundation this past weekend, and Andrew Yang was there, and I was going up to him and be like, oh, I wonder if he remembers me. I covered him religiously in Iowa.
How can he forget you, Ben?
Well, at one point, for 27 days in a row for NBC News on his bus, I chased him all around the state. There was one day where they started on the east side of Iowa, and instead of slowly meandering their way across, they were like, no, we're going to drive all the way across the state and then do an event there, and then all the way back the next day. I was like, this is a maniac. And when I was in line with him, a person came up to him right in front of me and harangued him for making jokes about Asian Americans, harangued him at length. And he said, you've set our community back, you've put us back, you are basically given people an open to make jokes about us. And I thought that was a very interesting thing, because up until that point, a lot of the criticism had come from the press corps, the Asian American elements of the press corps, I might add, especially Amy B. Wong from the Washington Post and Matt Stevens from the New York Times. We wrote about that. There was interest in that, but that was one of the first times that I actually seen an Asian American member of the electorate harangue him for that, which I thought was really, really interesting. Zohreen, I want to talk about Senator Kamala Harris now too, right? Vice President. Excuse me. When she was running, she was Senator, Vice President Kamala Harris. Can you talk a little bit about what your observations were when it comes to identity? Obviously, not the presidential election is not always solely about questions about identity, but that did pervade a lot of the public interest as to who she was as a candidate.
Yeah, there was a lot of criticism, I remember, from members of the South Asian community that she wasn't South Asian enough, right? That they felt that she leaned into her other side and her black side. And she certainly did a lot of events. I don't remember one single public South Asian event. And a lot of people in the South Asian community would say, she comes to us when she wants money, right? And that was a big criticism I remember hearing at that time. I will say, towards the end, remember November when she did that Mindy Kaling cooking video? When she got really desperate, the poll numbers were so low, and then she dropped out December 3rd. She has evolved in the way she presents herself publicly. Last Diwali, she had a big Diwali party at her house, and I remember, I went to it. I remember thinking...
Big flex, by the way.
Well, I remember also being kind of nervous to go, because I was like, this lady, I think she hates me. I covered her for a year, and I don't think she was always thrilled by the questions I asked her. I never got that sense, and it was fascinating going to the VP's residence, and she just full on embraced her South Asian side, and she apologized for not wearing the sari, but we know she would have gotten criticism probably, right, if she did. But she talked about her mom. She talked about the various trips to India. She talked at length. She went on and on about celebrating Diwali, growing up, and the sparklers. And we stood there and we lit sparklers on the vice president's lawn. And I remember thinking, oh my God, we're lighting fire on the VP's lawn. This is crazy. I can't believe Secret Service is allowing us to do this. And then 2 days later, she got up publicly at the White House and in front of all the cameras and talked at length about her South Asian side as well. So I think she has evolved. I think now she feels a little more comfortable publicly really going at length about her South Asian side. But during the trail, it was always just a little dabble here and there. My mom said this. My Indian American mom would, say that. But not really that much about her own experience. And so it was really cool to see that evolution of her as well. And it's still interesting. She still gets sometimes criticism that you hear about Nikki Haley as well. Why don't they lean into more of their South Asian side? And I thought about this a lot recently. There's a lot of women, South Asian women, who maybe don't always lean into their South Asian side, right? Especially post 9/11, we have this weird tug of war, some of us, with how much we lean into our identity and when. And I think, thinking about that makes some of us think a little differently about Nikki Haley and Kamala Harris and how much they do or do not lean in at any moment. So
yeah, Deepa, I'm curious. You had done some interesting reporting about when she was tapped as VP and the way that teams on the Democratic Party had wanted her to present a particular way. I'm curious if you could talk a little about she used the Tamil word chittis on stage, which is roughly translates to auntie, right? And I remember I looked it up, the word chitties, because we had mentioned it on a call, and then I looked at the Google Trends, and there's like chitties, boom, right here in August when she was on the stage at the DNC. But you have some interesting reporting on that you kind of dug into a little bit. I'd love for you to kind of explore the way that she was urged to appear as a candidate.
Yeah, I think to Zohreen's earlier point, like there was definitely like a little bit more of a hard turn once she was tapped as Joe Biden's VP, because quite frankly, like Biden needed her to be an outreach to voters of color. And reach out to Latino voters. She polled very well with Latinos. I remember the week that she got tapped as Biden's VP, like within 2 days, there was a Spanish language ad out for Joe Biden. Kamala Harris was the main person featured in that ad. So like this was a person, this is a lot of the reporting I did at NBC at that time, was about how she was being used as like the campaign's outreach to communities of color, to immigrant communities. And that requires her to then lean into kind of being outspoken and talking a lot more about like, yeah, my immigrant mom taught me this, or like when I was growing up, this was, you know, something we did. And so, yeah, I think that was a little bit of a transformation. But at the same time, I mean, your point at the very beginning, Ben, when we started was like, what is the playbook for Asian American candidates? It's not like we have a long history of Asian Americans running for president. It's not like Kamala Harris jumped into the race in like January 2019 and was like, oh, these are the things I'm supposed to talk about and these are the things I'm not supposed to talk about. That was not there. And so I think it's like some of that criticism, particularly from our own community, of like, oh, she's not talking about this enough. I definitely, you know, would push back on the reasoning behind that. Like what was the need for people to kind of be critical about that? Obviously, people want to be represented and they want to feel seen, and all of that is really important. But I do think there was a lot of nuance in that conversation that got missed, which was, you know, why that pressure was there to begin with, given her lived experiences as a South Asian and Black woman, and what that means growing up in Oakland, California, what that means for her traveling all over the world. She wrote about, even in her own autobiography, saying that her mom obviously was an Indian woman, but knew that she was raising 2 Black daughters. And so we have to be cognizant of that too, and we have to recognize that like this is a person who had a biracial experience, who was seen as a Black woman, who identified as a Black woman, continues to, obviously. And so that is something that I find really interesting as well, that collectively as a press corps, and I think also as a voter base, a lot of people didn't really know what to do with this person and this candidate when she jumped into the race. So there were a lot of questions. Didn't something happen where a reporter basically was like, how do you identify? And she was like, I don't want to answer this question. She didn't say that, but she was like, I identify as American. She was like, I'm an American. And that, for whatever reason, was not seen as a good enough response. But I think if Pete Buttigieg had said the same thing, and if Joe Biden had said the same thing, and if Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar had said the same thing, we would have all moved on and not thought about it anymore. And I do think another thing we should consider and think about as more Asian American candidates are jumping into the race and running for president and running for office is, why is that something we need to spend time on? Like, I understand it from a journalistic perspective that our job as reporters is to explain this person to the electorate and explain this person to the country. But not everybody gets those questions equally and evenly and equitably. And I think that's something we should think about a lot more as a press corps. Yeah. I remember especially when Senator Elizabeth Warren was running for president, and, you know, you and I both covered Senator Warren, there was a lot of questions about electability and what that meant. Electability, this mysterious buzzword of, do voters think that this person can take on then President Trump and win? And a lot of it was coded as, do you really think that a woman can become president of the United States? And there were so many swirling questions about women and the identity, and like, you know, there was so many coded things about that. I remember it was like, this is an impossible conversation to have, because it is just genuinely so complex that we can talk about it till the cows come home. And ultimately, you know, the type of voter in the United States does have some preoccupation with some of those characteristics, but a lot of that is in our heads, which is what it always helps that we have conversations like this and we talk about it as a press corps. And then, you know, to that similar end, Dylan, I want to bring you in here is with, you've been covering the former South Carolina governor, former Ambassador Nikki Haley. You've seen her now in 4 different states. You know, she's running for president. What are some of the key messages that she's offering, and what are the kind of ways that she's choosing to both identify or not identify?
Yeah, I've been spending a lot of time with the former UN ambassador, and she talks about race in a really interesting way. She's the first major Republican woman of color to run for the nomination and is appealing to a very different base of voters than, say, Kamala Harris was trying to appeal to when she was a primary candidate. You know, the majority of Asian American voters lean blue. That is not who is going to propel Nikki Haley to the presidency if she is to break through. And so she both leans into her race and her gender, and then also says that, you know, racism and glass ceilings are not barriers that she believes exist in this country. So one of the most popular lines in her stump speeches around the country is, "Take it from me, the first minority female governor in the country, America is not a racist country." And the attendees at the event love that pitch, but you know, the more critical view of it by some Asian American activists, et cetera, is that she's kind of trying to have it both ways, I think in a similar way to some of the criticism of Harris you mentioned. But it's interesting because it is kind of integral to how she talks about approaching politics. She talks about, "I grew up in rural South Carolina. I was not black enough to be black, not white enough to be white, the daughter of Indian immigrants." And she talks about her mom urging her to seek similarity with the kids who would bully her on the playground because of that. And she uses that to kind of frame how she talks about seeking consensus as a presidential candidate. Now, if it's about talking about when she removed the Confederate flag, or if it's about finding consensus around abortion, she kind of leans selectively into that biography to justify her approach and her messaging specifically as a woman of color.
Is there an element of it being surprising that a presidential candidate for the Republican nomination is openly talking about her minority background? Like, when you speak to political types of folks in South Carolina, you know, not like voters, but really just like people who are part of political apparatuses, are they surprised that a woman on the GOP side is actively being like, I am a minority and these are my minority experiences and things like that?
I think yes and no. I think they view it as an asset in the way that she can talk about some of these issues. I think a lot of the white base voters for the Republican Party I talk to are pretty aggrieved about the state of like race relations in the country and feel like they've been framed as like the villain, as they put it. And like, I had a voter in Iowa who was like, everyone just says I'm racist and like, how dare they? And so for them, they're like, this is a woman of color telling me I'm not racist. Like, that's incredible to have her as a messenger, and I think it's needed. That's their perspective, at least, of her approach to it. So I think that they like having a woman of color to be able to convey these messages as well. It's a very interesting, like, against identity politics, but also using identity politics kind of relationship.
Thing,
yeah, not just Haley, because Tim Scott.
Yeah,
Tim Scott
as well.
Same
exact
right.
game, and it
exactly.
is. I remember like circa 2018, 2020, like the phrase identity politics was like the most offensive thing to so many people. When like, guess what? We all have identities. Like, that, and identity politics is politics. So it's really interesting to see how that's changed.
Haley in her stump speech says she like hates identity politics. She doesn't believe in it. But then when you talk to voters at her events, they also say that they don't believe in identity politics, but then they say things that are in a way identity politics themselves, their belief that she will broaden the tent because of her identity.
It almost sounds like what Vivek Ramaswamy is also saying.
Yeah, we're going to get to him in a second. Ali, I know you've spoken and you've met with Nikki Haley a couple of times, and I'm curious what your experience is. Some of us have been too exposed to her as she's running for president, right? But what was your experience, perhaps, like in the past? Do you feel like there's been an evolution in the messaging around her identity and the changes around there?
Well, I have to say, because I've been thinking about this a lot since she's declared again, and I haven't heard a more nuanced explanation than what you just provided. I mean, Dylan, that really, as you were talking, I was thinking, oh my God, that's exactly what it is. It's that complexity. I can't say
that's why we got him.
because she's a complex character. I don't think there's evolution on that front. I think Nikki Haley has figured out, for better or for worse, that as it comes to her background, she's figured out what her lane is. The broader political issue with Nikki Haley or Tim Scott or any of these other particularly Republican candidates, is that they had an opportunity in 2015 to carve out a lane that could be their lane one day when they run for president, and nobody chose to do that. Nikki Haley didn't do it. She actually did choose a lane. She chose not to be in Trump's lane, and then somehow, like everybody else, got sucked right into it. So Nikki Haley's problem is going to be eclipsed. Her problem about who she is actually nothing to do with her ethnic identity. I will say that she, to some degree in 2023, if you're reading the room well, you're understanding, as I have evolved into as well, that your identity, whatever you choose to see that as, is instructive as to what you do and how you carry out your job, right? We're talking about it. It is all instructive to how we do our jobs. Well, it's also instructive to if you're going to be president of the United States, right? At this point, it feels like empty calories to hear that from Nikki Haley, because if it's true that these things caused you to be a consensus builder, because I identify with that, right? When I was a kid growing up in Toronto, I was the only one who didn't look like everybody else, and as a result, didn't want to draw any attention to that, and did try to do that kind of stuff and be a consensus builder. If that's true, lean into it. And talk about the degree to which you were referring to Kamala Harris earlier with that discussion as well. But, talk about how that's going to solve the problems of the country. At the moment, it all feels like a little bit of a dismissal. And I think we can have a good debate about whether this is, I think a lot of people would say it's not a racist country, but it is a country with racists. And that distinction is actually important, because the racists have a lot of sway, much more than many of us thought they would in 2023. I would love to be able to see those candidates who are not from the predominant culture in this country be able to lean into that and say, we have an existential problem with our politics in this country, and there's actually something about me that can solve that. And I'm not sure that Nikki Haley's landed there, and she's been doing this for a long time. Keep in mind, she's been talking about running for president for a long time. We're 8 years into her talking about running for president. At some point, you got to get it.
Do you feel like across those 8 years, she's immediately identified who she is and has not veered away from it?
You remember what debate was it where Trump was up there on the stage and she was sort of, expressing her disdain for who he was, and she was very clear about them. But so did Lindsey Graham, so did everybody else. Everybody else was done with Trump. Trump was the worst thing that ever happened to the Republican Party until Trump was the candidate. And until the only thing that Nikki Haley has done to carve out a lane is she's the one person who didn't wait for Trump to not be a candidate before she declared that she's actually running this time. That's actually impressive, because everybody else still doesn't want to get in the way of Donald Trump. She's trying to get back into her lane, but I'm not sure it's going to work. And then the numbers seem to indicate it's not going to work. But who knows with Donald Trump?
I'm interested in hearing, there's a lot of the contemporary candidates that we've been referring to, and I'm interested in wondering, Ali, where Bobby Jindal fits into all of this. I think that there's some laughter here where I don't know how people feel, but I'm just curious, Bobby Jindal, former governor of Louisiana, ran for president of the United States. I think you and I had talked about, Zohreen, that he was kind of like a precursor, right, in a lot of senses for Asian American candidates. Yeah. Did you ever cover?
No. I honestly I forgot about him, to be honest.
Okay.
So long ago.
I think there might have been some laughter about recognition.
Yeah.
Right. He was the hot thing, right? I mean, he was doing the post. State of the Union response that one year, which didn't go so well for him, but it never goes well for anybody. Like, that's just a terrible job. If anybody ever asked you to do so, say no.
You didn't think Marco Rubio was a raging success?
That's just a tough gig. But yeah, that's intriguing. Where is Bobby Jindal?
Did he prove that it could be done, or
it was pre-MAGA. It was pre-MAGA.
It was
pre-nonsense. Well, there was nonsense, but it wasn't this kind of nonsense, right? So what Donald Trump caused to happen is he really caused everybody to pick a side. And lots of people didn't pick a side. They picked his side by default. And so now they're swept up in it. Now you're in it because you didn't fight it when you could have. Bobby Jindal has the good fortune of not having been in that fight, really. He was just a conservative Asian, which is not an unusual thing. It's particularly not unusual for South Asians in this country to be conservative. And so I think if the world had stayed on that path in which the Republican Party didn't take a very hard right turn, Bobby Jindal may have been more relevant in this discussion right now, because he didn't do anything that got him out of the path of relevance. And to Nikki Haley's credit, whether or not you liked her policies at the United Nations, I thought that Donald Trump's United Nations ambassador was going to trash the United Nations, was going to go in there and pull it apart, because he has had a history of having people around there who don't like it. And she did a pretty good job there. So she didn't hurt herself on that front, but Bobby Jindal didn't hurt himself at all, because this all happened after he was.
Wait, but then to your point, like, did he prove it could be done, right? I would say the people who've proven it can be done are the leaders of the UK, Scotland, and Ireland.
That's right.
Like, you have a year and a half ago, if you had asked people in those countries, could there be an Asian American president or leader, right? They would have said no way. Well, now all three of those countries, the children of the empire, are now leading those three countries. And so, right, like, I think if we ask ourselves that question, can it be done? I mean, just look across the pond.
That's absolutely true. And then we also want to mention Vivek Ramaswamy. He is kind of, I think that I vaguely remember seeing a political headline is like, yes, Vivek Ramaswamy is the real deal, or like he's actually running. And I remember very distinctly the same kind of thing was said about Andrew Yang. And I think maybe Ali, you and I said basically like Vivek Ramaswamy is the Andrew Yang of the cycle.
Yes.
He is policy wonky, bold, brash, Asian American guy.
Has no chance of being president.
Well, and then,
independently wealthy,
never, right?
Former businessman.
Yeah, independently wealthy.
Put $10 million of his own money into his campaign.
It says he'd put $100 million. Which I think was just his coded way of saying he has $100 million.
He has a lot of money. And he's willing to go broke to be president.
Yeah.
Dylan, I think you've covered him yourself, and you saw him at the NRA and the Faith and Freedom Caucus in Iowa. I'm interested in hearing what, I think probably some people have seen him to news appearances, cable hits, and things like that. I'm curious as what he's like out in front of real voters and stumping on the campaign trail.
Yeah, I'm going on his bus tour in Iowa this week, so stay tuned for our coverage of that. A familiar scene for you back in the day. I was kind of surprised by how incredibly well received he has been at some of these big cattle calls I've been at the last couple weeks, because, in D.C., he's not a former senator, he's not the former UN ambassador, he's not the former vice president who isn't even in this race yet. And I think, like Andrew Yang, isn't really being taken seriously, but he has been a fixture on Fox News and on all these conservative podcast channels for years, where he's built up this brand of support. It's not like the Yang gang, but it's something that he has going there. And like at the NRA convention, he got a mid-speech standing ovation that like only competed with Trump when he suggested that in order to prevent China from invading Taiwan, the NRA should arm every household in Taiwan to like help prevent an invasion. And like
I can see the politics of this real. It's very clear what's happening right now.
People loved that idea, that pitch there. Like I think that he actually like is getting a more positive reception from some of the Republican primary voters than I think a lot of us like in DC would give him credit for. And he's also very interesting in the way he talks about race. Just like all these other Republican candidates of color we've discussed, like his big thing is he wants to completely cancel affirmative action, and he's anti-woke, and he doesn't like this idea of like victimhood being associated with race, and like it's unlike your traditional Republican candidate, at least in the messenger, and there is at least some audience for that in the base, but at the same time, is that going to compete with Trump or Ron DeSantis?
Right.
Not right now.
So if I want to, because those comparisons with Andrew Yang are going to come up.
Yes.
I'm going to defend Andrew Yang for a moment again, because he wrote it in a book, and he
shouted you out in his book.
He was not.
Vivek also wrote a book, by the way.
He wrote multiple books.
But here's the distinction. Andrew, like him or not, was relatively consistent throughout his entire campaign. Vivek Ramaswamy says stuff stop to stop that changes when he seems like he's sort of trying to evolve the campaign. So he wants to arm everybody in Taiwan, but he wants to pull out of Ukraine. He wants to get rid of the Department of Energy. He wants to get rid of the Department of Education. He says that he doesn't talk about wokeism, but he's got anti-woke campaign, like stickers and T-shirts and stuff like that of his campaign with his name on it. So he's got a consistency issue. He's definitely engaging. Like Yang, these rich entrepreneurs, I guess that's what happens when you make $50 million by the time you're 30, right? I'd be very interesting if I would have.
You're still
well, thank you. I was fishing for that. That's actually, I'm done. That's all I was looking for. Back to you. So my point is that he's definitely engaging. In a group of candidates, he will stand out. If he makes it to a debate, he will definitely be that guy where people who've never seen him before will say, huh, that's interesting. But I would like to see his campaign settle into a series of messages and policies that are consistent. He seems to be jumping around a little bit.
Yeah.
Wait, Ben, I'm not sure if we're allowed to ask you questions, but you covered Andrew Yang, an East Asian man covering the first Asian, I think the first East Asian male candidate. Right?
Yeah. So one of the interesting things about covering Andrew Yang was that when you're based in Iowa, you expect to cover a certain kind of voter group or a certain kind of candidate. And NBC was like, why don't you go cover Andrew Yang? He seems to be getting some traction. And I said, I actually know what this is about, guys. I see what's going on here. And I actually leaned into it very much. And it was Deepa who actually encouraged me to do so. I had written some really interesting pieces about his identity, about the way he uses humor and the jokes about him being Asian to kind of further his campaign and make him relatable to so many of these primary voters, which in Iowa, New Hampshire, were very white. And that was a way for him to connect to people. And that was his primary way of connecting to people, because otherwise he was very wonkish and bookish, and he wasn't good really at pressing the flesh sometimes. He didn't kiss any babies, and President Joe Biden, when he was running, was very famous for doing the long lines and shaking everyone's hands, and people were openly grieving with him, and he was hugging them and everything like that. Yang was never very good at that, so he used the jokes about his Asian identity to really connect with voters. And I thought that was really, really interesting. And then, what was that?
Connect with white voters.
Connect with white voters. And so that was always really interesting, trying to see him toe the line, and try and make a case for himself to these primary voters. And, and that's really one of the interesting things that we're here to discuss today is like a lot of the ways that we talk about identity. I think that people are irritated perhaps with and certainly the candidates can be irritated with the preoccupation that reporters and media people have with race and identity and appearance. But I think a lot of the reason for that is because many of the voters that we speak to specifically cite something about a candidate's identity. They say, that person is a mom, they're a mother, they have kids, they're black, they're white, they are Asian, he has a lot of plans, they don't have a lot of plans, they're wonky, they were a former teacher. A lot of the way that when people run for president of the United States is not necessarily on policy. I don't think there's anybody who read my post in the Meet the Press blog about Elizabeth Warren's agricultural policy. I really don't know, except for Ali.
Sorry.
And so, a lot of people the voters were interested in the way that these people were as people. They weren't necessarily always, they're not, I'm so interested in hearing how they were going to run the Department of Energy. That wasn't a preoccupation with voters. They were concerned a lot with matters of race and representation. And I thought that's really the big part of it. So I think, people who think that, this kind of conversation is frivolous or it's, dividing.
Back in the day, before we had sophisticated conversations like this about politics, the polling questions were, would you like to have a beer with this person?
Yes.
Right? And I was like, why does this matter? They're not having a beer with me and I'm not having a beer with them. I actually need them to run the country.
Well, you might have a beer with them.
I might.
Yeah.
But
tequila.
That's what I guess we've just never settled on. What's the thing that should cause a voter to like a presidential candidate? Should you like them? Should you want to have a beer with them? Should you relate to them? Should you really admire their experience? Should you think they're the smartest person on earth? Because if we were just going for the smartest people, we'd have had 2 women presidents in a row, right? So I just don't know that we've arrived on that. So now people are dabbling in the identity thing, and for some it works, and for some it's terrible, and they want to stay as far away from it as possible. But I don't know what the answer is. I don't want to, that's maybe what we should poll. What is going to cause you to make a decision to vote for a president? Because if you ask them, would you like to have a beer with them, this set of candidates will win. If you ask them, do you like their life experience, this set of people will win. If you ask them whose life experience is most like yours, another group of candidates will win. But what's the thing we want? How do we get people who vote to make decisions based on what the outcome should be. And I think that's it's an unsettled discussion right
And
now.
a lot of it is, I want to see them up on a stage, and how do they look? Do they wear a certain suit? Do they wear a jacket?
If there was an answer, we would have a consistency in who became president in the United States.
Yes.
If there was an answer to that question, then people who ran for president would follow that answer.
Right.
So the answer is that there is no answer, because if you look at the history of presidents in this country, you know, especially in recent history, it looks different.
Well, the answer last cycle was who can beat Trump.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
And so it was like, well,
Again,
Warren can't really
electability.
beat Trump, right? I think that was a question last
Thematically,
cycle.
yeah.
Which might be the question this time
Which might
around,
also be
too.
the question.
But
Right.
in most OECD developed nations, the answer has generally been, for the last 50 years, meritocracy. Who's actually the best candidate? And for some reason, we just decided to take the exit before we got to that one in America.
So I want to talk a little bit more about identity, and we're going to do a couple more of these, and then we're going to open this up to questions. So think about, really pay attention to these last set of questions and their answers. But Deepa, I want to go to you. You one of your favorite stories that you wrote for NBC News during the last election was headline, and I quote this: "Change or keep your name, for Kamala and Nikki and others, a story of identity, culture, and power." Can you talk a little bit about the concept of names and the way that ties into identity, and because I keep hearing it come up with Nikki Haley and with Kamala Harris?
Yeah, totally. Well, even when we were talking about Vivek Ramaswamy, I don't actually know how does he pronounce his name?
Is Vivek Ramaswamy?
No, how does he pronounce his first name?
Do we know?
I don't know.
Whoa, caught me on that. I did not research.
Okay, yeah, because
someone knows.
Vivek.
That's how he pronounces it.
Yes.
Okay.
Vivek.
No, Vivek, like Vivek, just like.
Yeah, the only reason I asked is because that's my brother's name. So I know how it's pronounced. I was just curious how he pronounced
He
it.
sounds like an Indian person.
Oh,
Hey.
God.
Wow.
Okay, so correction
Big
for
ups,
the panel. Yeah, it's Vivek. And, his journey is going to be an interesting addition to this whole concept that I kind of explored in 2020. The reason I wrote that story was because a lot of people were used, during the course of the primary election, you would meet brown voters sometimes on the campaign trail who would be like, well, it's not Kamala, it's Kamala. You should say it right, or you should say it correctly. And then when Nikki Haley kind of was in the mix of criticizing Joe Biden's policies and his choice in selecting Kamala Harris and things like that, there was actually a South Asians for Biden Twitter account that was not affiliated with the campaign. It was an independent Twitter account that kind of functioned as sort of a community posting situation. And they criticized Nikki Haley, and they were like, well, if you don't think America's a racist country, because remember she gave that speech, and she was like, America's not a racist country. They were like, well, if you say America's not a racist country, then why did you change your name to Nikki? Why do you go by Nikki instead of Nimrata, which is her first name? And a lot of people were in the comments, they're like, bruh, her name is Nikki. That is her middle name. Nikki is also a very common Punjabi pet name, little one is what it translates to. And so there was all these swirling conversations around well, this is correct, this is not correct, this is authentic, this is not authentic. And I was kind of whoa, where are we going with this conversation? We brought up Bobby Jindal earlier, whose name is not Bobby. Yeah, and he chose the name Bobby from watching the Brady Bunch as a kid. And basically the TLDR of the article is that your name is a personal choice. Whatever way Kamala Harris wants to pronounce her name is the right way. And I think there is criticism, there is an open door for criticism, I should say, for the way people are well, you're saying your name wrong. It's your name. The way that, I can't look at Dylan and be like, you dressed wrong for this event. You dressed how you wanted to dress. You picked the clothes out of your closet and you put them on, and that is your choice. Someone gave you your name, but the way you choose to take it in the world is up to you. And so Kamala, some people would say it Kamala, and she has said, my grandmother would call me Kamala, but she says Kamala. I say Deepa instead of Deepa, and it depends on who I'm talking to. I change that all the time, but no one can tell me that I'm doing it incorrectly. The same way that no one can tell Nikki Haley, you aren't really brown or you're not Indian enough because you chose to go by Nikki. There's a very interesting conversation there. But anyway, I got a lot of enjoyment out of reporting that story, because I think what really struck me was a number of people outside of the Asian diaspora, outside of the subcontinent, who really related to that. I had so many people reach out to me who are from all kinds of backgrounds, who have unique names, and some that are not unique. Like Kamala is not that unique of a name in India. Like it's very common, but perceived as unique, I should say, who really related to that and felt like that was a conversation that we don't have enough. And so that was why it was one of my favorite stories to write.
And then, we're talking a lot about like the way that, there's the kinship we know with Asian voters and the way that they hear people's names and connect with them. I want to talk a little bit about Asian voters and, I believe AAPI data, which is a data collecting organization, and as far as news organization is concerned, is one of the few places that we commonly cite statistics. We go to Pew, we go to Gallup, but sometimes like the slice of the Asian electorate is just so small that the data is not as reliable. Karthik Ramakrishnan at AAPI Data and the folks over there, they do a lot of great work, and we cite their data all the time. But there's not that many Asian American voters, writ large, so to speak. But sometimes they do make an impact in kind of outsized ways. And, Zohreen, you were talking recently to a prominent Democratic consultant.
James Carville.
It's James Carville, okay. Well, prominent name. And, you kind of posed a question to him about, do Asian American, essentially, right, is like, do Asian American voters matter? Are there enough of them?
I think the question was, is it worth it to, like, should we be talking about campaigning to Asian American voters more? Because he was talking about the African American vote on stage. And he said, his point of view was they're too dispersed around the country. And then he said, what was the second thing he said? Too dispersed. And, they don't have a shared common experience like black voters. And then I asked, an Asian American campaign staffer who worked for Biden, he said, look, they're also very hard to campaign to, right? Like if you're campaigning to a black voter, you don't have to translate anything. If you're campaigning to a Latino voter, you translate in one language. If you're trying to campaign to an Asian American voter, there are multiple languages. Like in Nevada, when Joe Biden was running, and they had a lot of money, right? It takes money to campaign in different languages. They were campaigning in Chinese, in Korean, in, I think, Vietnamese, in the Filipino papers. They just campaigned in English. But there was a lot of thought that went into that. Like, in what language do you target specific voters? Do they want to be campaigned in their native language, or do they want to be campaigned to in English? That takes so much research. It takes so much money to translate and to get it right. You don't want to have that embarrassing scenario where you translate it incorrectly. And so it's hard. It's hard to campaign to Asian American voters, even though we're the fastest growing voting bloc in the country. We have so many apparently now candidates. You have three this cycle: Vivek, Nikki Haley, and Kamala Harris at the bottom of the Biden ticket. Next cycle, there's already murmurs about Ro Khanna, wanting to jump into that race. But at the same time, it's fascinating because it's so hard to campaign to those populations.
That was something I talked a little bit about as well when I covered 2020. Was typically in U.S. history, if you come from a family where your parents voted, you are more likely to vote. That is historically how voting trends have worked. In immigrant families, our parents come to this country and there is not necessarily a history of voting here, or in some cases, there's not a positive history of participating in elections in the countries that they came from. And so one thing that I think is really interesting in Asian communities, and this happens in Latino communities as well, is that voting, it's flipped. Voting comes from the bottom up. If your kids vote, and your kids are taking, like I took my mom to the polls. That's the only way my mom would have voted, is because I took her and I showed her how to do it. And it took years of being like, this is where you go. This is how you cast your ballot. This is what we do. And now she does it on her own. And that's not an uncommon experience, I think, for a lot of Asian immigrant children. That kind of voting tradition is built up instead of down. And that's something I think that campaigns would be smart to figure out and factor in.
One of the things that I was in Nevada and I was reporting on AAPI voter groups and things like that, and I spoke to a Asian American voting group. And the guy basically was like, I don't know why the Democrats bothered to publish all of these voting materials in Tagalog, which is the written Filipino language. We all speak English. And I was like, oh, man, what a quote. That's awesome. I'm sure the Democratic operator was like, oh, my God, how much money did we spend for these consultants, the translators? And I thought that was really interesting. And what was always so interesting to me, too, is that when I would hear the Asian American voting groups talk, they would always talk about Asian voters being the quote-unquote margin of victory. They were like, there's not that many of us, perfectly honestly. But there's just enough that if you got all of us, you would swing it, pretty much one way or the other. And I thought that was always like a really interesting philosophy to have, were the margin of victory. And I think, though, what is so interesting and fascinating about that mindset, right, is that I think that is actually rapidly changing, which is why we're all here today. I want to now open it up to questions. If you've got a question, there's a microphone in the back, right down here in front.
Shut it out.
No, go for it.
Thank you. Thank you for being fast. I mean, I see that you're all journalists because quick.
Oh, talk fast.
Yeah. Question. According to Brookings, Asian Americans are the fastest growing population in the United States. So not about 2024 maybe, but further, there is a new Supreme Court case coming out, affirmative case that is affirmative action case that's coming out. Mm-hmm. And I think that's going to create some kind of friction within the Democratic Party, because the social justice group, which is trying to, adhere to affirmative action, and there's a liberal, more of a moderate group, which is, more based on meritocracy and merits. Where do you see that, and how do you think that people who are trying to get the votes will align themselves? Are they going to support affirmative action, or are they going to be against it because it involves Asians? This is, I know, tricky.
My mom's going to watch this video, right, Mom?
Yeah.
Right down the barrel?
Yeah.
All right, let's see. Who wants to take that?
Ben referenced AAPI data earlier, and based on the data and the polling they've done, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong if anyone has seen anything different here, but it's primarily Chinese Americans and Indian Americans that I think lean towards opposing affirmative action. Writ large, the Asian American community, as diverse and split up as we all are, does support affirmative action. But it is those two subgroups that I think are an increasing group of people that oppose it.
But the largest, that's my point.
Yeah, no, and they are larger in the grand AAPI community. I don't necessarily have an answer to your question, but I think something that's really interesting to point to is the Virginia governor's race, where Glenn Youngkin beat Terry McAuliffe. And that race and Glenn Youngkin's campaign really fixated on education for AAPI voters and what the issue of education, that was, like, remember the peak of critical race theory. Like, we were talking about that every day. That was like the big cultural argument that Republicans were trying to make. The way they have framed the argument over education, and in recent months, the way they have framed the argument over crime, is something that I think is really going to make an impact on Asian voters, and already has been making an impact on Asian voters in this city and in California as well. There's a really good article by the New York Times recently about how the local races in New York, Asian-dominated neighborhoods in New York City, have started shifting red. And I think, like, if you look at how Asian Americans are polling on crime and they are polling on education, that Supreme Court case and maybe what comes of that will make a really interesting indent, I think, on how Asian voters are kind of going forward. Because as much as we talked about earlier, like, Asian voters tend to turn blue, they are also the voter group that is least committed to a political party. Democrats don't have a, domineering, we've locked down Asian voters. I think they like to think that they do. Yeah. But there is not enough money, there's not enough time, there's not enough investment that either political party is putting into Asian voters. And I think Republicans, particularly in this last midterm election in Nevada, a number of RNC offices have started opening up all over the country in predominantly Asian communities. You are going to see a lot more of that. And I think if that case, goes one way or the other, the political response to that from either party will be very critical.
I think one of those things is the observation, right, is it was the same thing with Latino voters and Hispanic voters. There was a lot of discussions on this ethnic group and the way that these people identify is a lock for Democrats. It's done. Everyone talks about immigration and blah, blah, blah. And then we saw that in a lot of the elections, people don't actually think that way. People's identities are complex and multi-layered, and they aren't going to lean one way because of their skin color on the back of their hand, right? It is a very complex thing. And so, my observation through just people that I speak to, there are a lot of differing opinions about that. And I've heard really a lot of older folks in the Asian American community kind of are irritated about questions about affirmative action. And I think that you can see that a lot of younger voters and Asian Americans are really more for affirmative action. It's like a very interesting cultural shift. I think it ties also to a lot of the like political differentials about voting and things like that too. Dylan, you?
Yeah, I think just to add to what Deepa said, when I was talking to like Republican consultants before the midterms about how they were hoping to win over Asian American voters, especially in places like California, the first two Korean American congresswomen, the three big issues were crime and tying that to anti-Asian hate. It was the economy and framing that around small businesses that might be like the mom and pop businesses in these Asian communities. And then it was education all around the frame of affirmative action. So I think that there's going to be a huge push from Republican candidates and strategists if and when the Supreme Court case comes out to use that to try to attract these Asian voters.
Another question. This side of the room is very hands up. Is anybody on this side? Trying to be fair. All right, we're down in front, just because I'm just trying to be fair, guys.
Sorry about that.
No problem. Step it up this side.
I'm a little bit confused by some of the things I'm hearing and some of the conversations I've had with elected officials. So I believe someone of you said that the Asian American community leans Democratic. When I speak to Grace Meng, you know, the representative from Queens,
right,
she tells me all the time the tremendous difficulty she has because the community in her district does not lean Democratic, and she has a very hard time. They're very conservative. In conversations I've had with Kamala Harris, the first thing she does is she tells you how to pronounce her name. She is extremely emphatic about that. So I'm not sure, you know, I respect entirely what you're saying, but it's not the experience I've had.
That's a fair observation. Does anyone want to take a crack at this?
Are you wondering what the breakup of the numbers are? I mean, because we are talking about Asian Americans more broadly. Like Indian Americans, 68 are Democrat. Filipino Americans, 68. Korean Americans, 67%. Chinese Americans, 56. Like, is that what you're sort of asking? Like how?
I think. Well, one of the things is that, and this is kind of also
Being apart from the statistics,
right,
from people who are in the field,
right.
That's not what I'm hearing.
Yes, and to be fair, so here's what the interesting thing and the complexities I have found in speaking to, for example, here at NBC News, we have a column called NBC Asian American. They cover a lot of Asian American issues, politics, sports, celebrity news, and I think one of the interesting things is that there is a lot of complexity around the ways that we, as national organizations, have to cover communities that have wildly different opinions based on where they live, right? As national news organizations, one of the things that's like, you know, it's like the same thing with like polling data, right? We look at large sample sizes to the best of our ability, and we have to draw extrapolations from that data. And one of the things that we've seen, right, is that, you know, nationally, kind of writ large, based on the polling data that we have, and again, the Asian American electorate is relatively small, perhaps the polling data is not as reliable as we hope it is that typically Asian American, the electorate writ large leans slightly to the left. But as we've kind of talked a little bit about, right, it's not a lock. It's not a guaranteed thing, right? And I think this kind of gets back to Hispanic and Latino voters as well. There was a lot of talk about how they were a lock for Democrats, and then you talk about Cubans, Venezuelans, and the list goes on. And I think a lot of that thinking about the way that we consider the electorate writ large and then breaking it down into its subgroups and more granular, that can be really tough. And I know that, you know, Congresswoman Meng is out in Queens, and there's been a lot of anti-Asian hate, and that kind of leans into, again, what we were talking about discussions about crime and small businesses and things like that. And those are very tricky, you know, discussions that I think that a lot of political consultants are having. But then at the end of the day, too, is it worth our time and effort to flip these people, as, you know, James Carville was saying, like, is there enough of them that we need to worry so much about it? You know, I think that the discussion really is that they're probably still having to this day.
Or enough of them in one place, right?
Correct, yeah, exactly. All right, we're going to go right down here. This side of the room is getting their chance.
Well, I wanted to mention kind of maybe another aspect in the electorate, Asian American electorate, is generational,
right?
And how we are the fastest growing population, but that's being driven in large part by immigration. Mm-hmm. And so when we're talking about whether the electorate is Democratic or Republican, that also has to do with generational issues. I mean, we can all talk about. I can talk about when my parents, when I was a kid, listening to conversations, and the aunties and uncles were all diehard Republicans, and now they would never even fathom any of those, Republican policies. And I think that generational aspect is probably a part of this. The electorate, immigration from India has shifted in terms of where it's from. The same is true Chinese population is more mainland now than it was during the 60s and 70s. So I think that's a factor as well, the generational issues and in terms of how people view America.
Just out of curiosity, when did your parents come here?
So my parents were 1970s immigrants.
Okay. We spoke about this. All right. I think you have an interesting theory about the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965.
Yeah, I don't have too many thoughts on the evolution of, from possibly from Republican to Democrat, and I don't have the stats on that. But the one thing that we did talk about was the binding sort of thread between a lot of these candidates, and all of their parents came around 1965 or after. And I find that just so fascinating, right? Because everyone asks the question, why are we seeing so many Asian American candidates? How are we seeing a Nikki Haley and a Kamala Harris and a Vivek Ramaswamy and a Andrew Yang and a maybe Ro Khanna jumping in 4 years? Well, all their parents came around this time, and I nerded out a little bit. I was looking at the history.
Something about the Cold War, Sputnik.
1958, the Sputnik was, Americans were really upset about this. They wanted people with more engineering, math, and science skills. 1965, the LBJ signed the immigration law into law, and he said it would not be revolutionary. It was very revolutionary, right? It changed the face of this country. They wanted skilled workers, especially in math, science, engineering, and we were talking about how, these people come to the United States. It's an intellectual Olympics. Yeah, no shit. Their kids are going to run for president one day, right? And that's what we're seeing now. And so you have all these candidates of Asian American descent.
A very specific age group, right?
Very specific, right. Yeah. And I think that's one of the most fascinating things about this rise and the race and representation. This moment in time and history kind of led to what we're seeing now.
Yeah. I think we're going to have time for one more question.
There's someone in the back.
Yes, in the back over here in the pink.
Hi, firstly, thank all the panels. I'm really impressed of your depth and insight, because I don't see a lot of political analyst journalists on TV very often. So kudos to you all. So we're talking about divided votes, Democrat and Republican. Nobody mentioned Andrew Yang's new party, Forward Party.
Yes.
And I want to ask, what's your view about the momentum he can gain by 2024? He might be running on that ticket.
Right.
Would that be all Asian Americans? Do you think it will, generate a lot of people? Because according to survey, a lot of people feel that Democrats are too left and Republicans are too right, and there's a lot of people in the middle.
Well, I actually spoke when I saw him this weekend. I know
little flex there.
Well, okay. I know he's working, because he is he was like, I can't play this celebrity basketball game this weekend. I have to go raise money in Seattle. And I was like, okay, buddy. So I see what's going on there. Does anyone want to weigh in on this?
I think there's zero chance of this becoming anything. I like the concept, and a lot of politicians whom I've met and spoken to over the years, going back all the way to a guy like John Huntsman, who, everybody said they wanted him to be president, but he never got past 2% in the polls. The reality is there's nobody there. I wish there were people there, but that's not where the American voter is. The American voter is wildly polarized, and everyone will tell you that they're not part of that group. For all of us, we'll all talk to Americans, and none of them are polarized, except this is what we are. So I think it's conceptually interesting, but we have such structural problems in our politics right now that people who you just can't get rallies of people out in the center. You can't get people to wear those T-shirts and fly those flags and turn out in big numbers. What you have seen in the last midterm elections and in the 2020 elections was you can push Americans too far. You can get them to come out and say, that's a bridge too far. We might see that in the next election, depending on how tired you are of all the shootings that you see or draconian abortion measures. But that's what it takes to get people to either throw someone out of office or motivate them to vote in big numbers. We've seen I'd really like the answer to be, wow, this is something. This is going to be the thing in 4 or 8 years. I don't see it happening. I think that we're at a point in American politics where, particularly for the Republican Party, something dramatic is going to have to happen in that party. And that might be the end of Trump. It might be a serious loss, which they may not suffer in 2024, so it may have to happen in 2028. They can't even attract moderate candidates. I mean, it's a real struggle. They've got a few moderate candidates running for president in the Republican Party, but generally speaking, it's become tough. Can you imagine that in the country of 330 million people, that you have to say extreme things in order to get elected? So I think I wish, Andrew, we're on to something that would be successful, but I think we're some time away from that.
I think one of the interesting things, too, and that we've been kind of witness to this, is that one of the interesting things about covering presidential elections from the front seat is that it's not just some person goes up on stage and talks in front of a lot of people. The apparatus that got those people into those seats and also organizes the caucuses and organizes primaries and the structures that allow for the fundraising and the creation of, these policy papers and everything are so large and arguably intractable that it is kind of hard to envision someone mustering the resources to build something similar.
Unless the Republican Party becomes the forward party.
Right.
And attracts moderates. Like, that's the kind of thing that could happen, that enough Republicans leave the party and say, what do you do if you're an ex-Republican but you don't really want to vote for Democrats, or you're not a Democrat, or you think, as you said, Democrats are too left? Does something shift to create that infrastructure in Forward? And there are a couple of examples, right? There's Forward, and there's a few other little examples. If they all got together one day, but keep in mind, if one Republican candidate, if 6 or 7 moderate Republican candidates got together and said, how about we don't all run independently and get taken out one at a time by Donald Trump, but we all consolidate our resources, someone might beat Donald Trump. But that's also not going to happen. So the Republican Party needs to determine what it's going to be, and then based on what happens there has to be a determination as to whether there's a space for a new party or a third party. Some Republicans insist there'll be a phoenix rising from the ashes. They'll reconstitute their party somehow and purge themselves of extremist elements. For now, the Democratic Party doesn't have to. They don't really have to struggle with this one at the moment. There may be a time when the Republican Party moderates a little bit that people will say, well, the Democratic Party's got some extreme fringes, but the leadership of the Democratic Party is not on the fringes at the moment. The problem is the leadership of the Republican Party is being heavily influenced by the fringes. In the Democratic Party, they're there, but they're not controlling the levers of power.
Joe Biden's still president.
Joe Biden's still president. That's right.
I want to take a quick second to do a quick wrap-up thoughts. We've talked a lot about identity and politics and what it's like to run for president and all these different things. And, the question that I posed at the beginning of this is, what's in the rule book to running as an Asian American person for president of the United States? And what are the hard and fast rules they seem to follow? What are things that they should do or must do in order to be the next president? And kind of like, and if you don't know, that's okay too. But I'm going to start over with Dylan. What do you see as one of the hard and fast rules in that rule book?
I don't know if there really is a rule book yet. I mean, Deepa mentioned there weren't a huge bench for Kamala Harris to look at and be like, she ran successfully as an Indian woman, that's how I'm going to do it. I think that each of these candidates is trying to define it for themselves, which is part of the challenge for these candidates of color who don't look like the traditional presidential candidates we've had the entire history of the country.
Deepa, what's in the rule book?
There is no rule book, and the only thing you need to do to run for president is raise a lot of money to make it out of the prime. That's it.
Allie?
I think of what we think about as Asia and the Pacific Islands, it's half the freaking world. Population-wise, it's more than half the world. So we're different colors, we're different faiths, we speak different languages, we come from different places. That's kind of pluralism, right? That's the thing that we're lacking in this country and in our politics. And I would say that if there's something to lean into about being Asian American, it's the idea that you're not one thing. You're a lot of things, and the ability to negotiate that in your life in America and in your own community and your own family. If somebody could translate that into how that makes them a better president, I think that might be intriguing to me.
I don't think anyone's going to love this answer, but I still think if you are a campaign manager or advisor to a Nikki Haley, or next cycle Kamala Harris, or even this cycle if she's on the bottom of the ticket, I think that campaign manager or that advisor is still probably telling them, yeah, you probably don't want to lean in too much to your South Asian side. Not quite yet, right? I mean, they might be saying the population numbers just don't make sense, right? 1.5% of this country is South Asian. Maybe just play it safe. They might be saying, take the key and throw it. I don't know. I don't actually know for sure. But based on how you sort of see them, you've seen them in the last many years, right? Some of the actions Nikki Haley has taken, right? Like checking off the white box and identifying, her religion and all of that, and seeing how Kamala Harris's campaign, how they campaigned last cycle. That's something I can imagine them saying. That's a part of the rule book.
I think the reason why I asked that for all of you is because it matters a little bit what we think. And I think it really matters what you all think. We are lucky enough and we are so thankful enough that we've gotten the opportunity to see these people up close and personal and speak to them and interview them and hear from them. But ultimately our observations, and we're trying to bring the best information back to you all so you all can make informed decisions about who you want to see be the next president of the United States. And I hope you learned something over that today. So Dylan, Deepa, Ali, and Zohreen, thank you so much for speaking on this. What an outstanding panel. We're so lucky to have you. Give it up.
Thank you.